Claire Whitman adjusted the flowing silk of her gown as she entered the grand ballroom, the soft sparkle of sequins catching the crystal chandeliers above. The air was thick with perfume, champagne, and the quiet hum of sophisticated conversation, a symphony of wealth and influence that seemed to pulsate through every ornate corner of the mansion. She placed a careful hand on her growing belly, feeling the gentle kick of the child within, and drew a slow, steadying breath. Every eye in the room seemed to flick toward her in admiration, yet despite the glimmering accolades, a heavy unease weighed on her heart. Edward Harrington, her husband, stood across the room with the easy charm of a man accustomed to attention. His tailored tuxedo fit perfectly, his smile effortless as he nodded to acquaintances and socialites alike. Yet there was a subtle distance in his demeanor, a coldness in the eyes that had once held warmth for her alone. He laughed at the right moments, engaged in polite conversation, and held her hand lightly in passing, but each gesture felt calculated, detached, as if he were performing a role rather than sharing a moment with his wife. Claire noticed the small things, the way he glanced at his phone, the way his attention wavered even when she spoke, and the occasional tightness around his jaw whenever someone mentioned her pregnancy. She tried to anchor herself in the beauty of the evening, the gold-trimmed tables, the towering floral arrangements, the string quartet playing softly near the entrance, but her mind was restless. Whispered conversations drifted through the room, fragments of gossip that made her heart tighten. Stolen glances between Edward and other guests, subtle gestures that might have been innocent, gnawed at her confidence and sense of security. She caught herself wondering if it was paranoia or if the unease she felt was real, if the distance she sensed was more than fatigue or social obligation. Despite her anxiety, Claire moved gracefully through the crowd, offering polite smiles, accepting compliments, and trying to appear serene, as if the glittering gala had no power over her inner turmoil. She drew quiet strength from her pregnancy, reminding herself that she carried life within her, that no social slight or betrayal could diminish the significance of that truth. Yet, beneath the calm exterior, tension coiled tightly around her heart, each glance at Edward a reminder that the man she had loved so deeply might be slipping further away, ensnared in desires and distractions she could neither control nor predict. The gala shimmered around her, a world of wealth and celebration, but for Claire, the evening was shadowed by uncertainty, betrayal, and the quiet, growing question of what her future with Edward might truly hold. Vanessa Blackwood entered the gala with the confidence of someone who knew every eye would follow her, and she thrived on it. Her gown shimmered under the chandeliers, a striking contrast to Claire's elegant but understated ensemble, and she moved through the crowd with deliberate poise, every step calculated to draw attention. A soft laugh escaped her lips as she approached Edward Harrington, tilting her head in a way that suggested intimacy and private amusement, though their conversation was conducted in full view of the elite guests. The air around them seemed charged, as if her presence alone could bend the social gravity toward her favor. Vanessa's eyes sparkled with mischief and ambition, catching onlookers in subtle but undeniable ways. She leaned just a little too close when speaking to Edward, her hand brushing his arm in a casual, deliberate manner. Each movement was designed to assert a claim, a silent reminder that she existed in this space not merely as a guest, but as a force that Edward could not resist. To anyone watching closely, the familiarity and attention he offered her were not purely innocent, they were indulgent, deliberate, and provocative. Claire, navigating the room with careful composure, could not ignore the effect Vanessa had on her husband. Every glance, every smile, every slight tilt of her head was a calculated effort to undermine Claire's presence, to insinuate that she had a claim to Edward's attention that was unchallenged by social convention or morality. Edward, for his part, indulged her admiration without hesitation. He smiled, laughed, and nodded as if caught in the thrill of her gaze, oblivious or indifferent to the discomfort it caused his wife. The tension between them was subtle but electric, a current that ran through the room unnoticed by most, but painfully visible to Claire. Guests whispered discreetly, sensing the undercurrent, and some eyes flickered with curiosity or judgment, though none dared confront the situation directly. Vanessa's mastery of social manipulation became increasingly evident as she floated through the gala, drawing Edward into her orbit while casting shadows on Claire's presence. Every gesture, every glance, and every soft word reinforced the notion that she felt untouchable, entitled, and in control. Claire, standing amid the glittering spectacle, recognized the audacity of Vanessa's intrusion and the deliberate intent behind each move. It was a silent war of attention and influence, with Edward's indulgence tipping the balance, leaving Claire increasingly aware of the betrayal unfolding just steps away from her, beneath the dazzling veneer of wealth and celebration. Claire Whitman felt the weight of the evening pressing against her, a mixture of social expectation, physical discomfort from her pregnancy, and the subtle tension radiating from Edward's distracted attention. She had navigated the crowd gracefully, exchanging pleasantries, smiling politely, and attempting to maintain the dignity that came naturally to her, even as Vanessa Blackwood lingered dangerously close to her husband. But the fragile equilibrium shattered in an instant, a moment so brazen it sent shockwaves through the gala. Vanessa, moving with deliberate precision, reached for the delicate fabric of Claire's gown under the guise of adjusting her own dress. A swift, calculated motion, and the silk along the hip gave way, a visible tear spreading along the elegant seam. The gasp that rippled through the room was instantaneous. Cameras flashed, capturing every expression of disbelief, every whispered exclamation among the elite guests who had been silently observing the subtle undercurrents all evening. Claire's heart lurched as she felt the cool draft against her skin and realized the full scope of the public humiliation unfolding before her. Frozen for a moment, Claire's hand instinctively flew to the torn section of her gown, her eyes wide as shock and embarrassment mingled with the sharp sting of betrayal. The pregnancy that she had once seen as a source of pride and gentle attention now amplified her vulnerability, drawing even more scrutiny from onlookers. Her cheeks burned with heat, a combination of shame, anger, and disbelief at the audacity of Vanessa's act. Whispers fluttered across the room like a gust of wind, magnifying the sense of exposure and helplessness. Edward's reaction was a mixture of hesitation and indecision, a moral collapse laid bare for the social elite to witness. He reached toward Vanessa almost reflexively, caught between indulgence in her boldness and the faint remnants of conscience tugging at him. His failure to protect Claire, his inability to assert himself as a husband in that moment, only intensified the humiliation. The guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing the imbalance, and the cameras continued to click, documenting every micro-expression of shock, confusion, and silent judgment. Claire's composure wavered, but she forced herself to stand tall despite the tear, her gaze sweeping the room to measure reactions, noting faces of curiosity, disdain, and sympathy. In that chaotic instant, the gala's glittering perfection transformed into a tableau of betrayal and exposure, a dramatic spectacle that would linger in the memories and photographs of all present. Vanessa's deliberate act of aggression had struck at Claire's dignity, Edward's moral integrity had crumbled visibly, and the power dynamic in the room had shifted dramatically, marking the beginning of a public unraveling that no amount of wealth, charm, or social standing could contain. James Whitman's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene from across the grand ballroom, his posture unyielding despite the flicker of surprise that ran through the crowd. The moment Claire's gown tore, a calculated cruelty by Vanessa Blackwood, he felt a surge of protective instinct rise within him, fierce and immediate. But his response was not impulsive. James was a man accustomed to power, influence, and control. He had built his empire on strategy, patience, and the ability to strike decisively when the moment demanded. Fury coursed through him, yes, but it was tempered by precision, a lethal combination of paternal devotion and calculated intellect. He watched Claire instinctively attempt to cover the tear, her vulnerability amplified by her pregnancy, and noted Edward's conflicted hesitation. His jaw tightened as he registered the moral collapse of his son-in-law in real time. The whispers, the pointed glances, the flashes of cameras, all of it was a public record of humiliation, and James understood the full magnitude of the implications. It was not merely a personal affront, it was a social and legal minefield that could affect reputations, alliances, and fortunes. He made mental notes, cataloging every expression, every movement, and every potential leverage point that could be used to rectify the imbalance. Yet even as anger simmered, James maintained a calm exterior, a calculated serenity that belied the storm within. He understood the power of perception, especially in a room filled with elite guests who were quick to judge and slower to act. He did not immediately confront Edward or Vanessa, instead, he allowed the scene to unfold long enough for the crowd to bear witness to the audacity of Vanessa's act and the failure of Edward to protect his wife. Each camera flash, each murmur of shock, worked in his favor, creating a documented trail of misconduct that would serve as undeniable evidence when the time came to act. As the gala continued around the torn gown and strained conversations, James's mind worked rapidly, mapping out both immediate and long-term strategies. Legal ramifications, public perception, and private leverage, all were being analyzed with methodical precision. His paternal instinct demanded justice and protection for his daughter, but his experience and wealth taught him that true power lay in subtlety, patience, and timing. Every move he would make from this moment forward would be deliberate, swift, and devastatingly effective. In that moment of controlled fury, James Whitman became both guardian and strategist. He allowed the gala to record the humiliation, permitted the social dynamics to shift visibly, and let the initial shock sink in. Behind the composed facade, he was already orchestrating the steps that would ensure Edward and Vanessa paid for their audacity, both publicly and irreversibly. The fire of his wrath was quiet yet unyielding, promising that no act of betrayal against Claire would go unanswered, and that justice, precise and calculated, would be delivered in full measure. The gala had barely settled into quiet murmurs when the first ripples of consequence began to spread through the elite social network. James Whitman, ever observant and strategically minded, had already begun acting behind the scenes, leveraging his wealth, influence, and reputation to turn the tables on Edward Harrington and Vanessa Blackwood. Though the guests were still sipping champagne and exchanging polite smiles, subtle shifts in alliances were taking place with almost imperceptible precision. Influential figures who had once vied for Edward's favor now hesitated, casting wary glances at him as if questioning the stability of his judgment, the strength of his character, and his ability to maintain control over both his public and private image. Edward's aura of unassailable authority began to fracture in real time. Guests whispered discreetly, exchanging fragments of what they had witnessed, the audacity of Vanessa's act, the pregnant bride's humiliation, and Edward's failure to intervene. Each murmured remark carried weight, feeding the growing perception that Edward's power, carefully cultivated through charm and wealth, was now tenuous. Even those who had previously supported him began to step back, hesitant to be associated with a man whose moral compass appeared publicly compromised. The cracks in his social armor, once invisible, were now painfully evident to anyone paying attention. Vanessa, attuned to the subtle shifts in energy around her, felt a creeping unease. She had always believed that her influence and social capital were inherent, derived from her glamour, ambition, and ability to captivate Edward. But now, standing amid the very same crowd that had once elevated her, she realized the fragile foundation of her power. Her status was entirely tethered to Edward, and as his standing began to falter under the quiet orchestration of James Whitman, her own position wavered. A flicker of anxiety crossed her otherwise confident expression. The realization that she was not untouchable settled heavily on her shoulders. Meanwhile, James's network of allies and associates worked quietly, reinforcing the narrative of Edward's failure and Vanessa's audacity. Gossip, subtle yet insidious, began to travel through social circles, reaching those who had not attended the gala but whose influence mattered just as much. Invitations were withheld, conversations shifted, and the perception of stability that Edward had relied on so heavily began to erode. In those hours after the gala, the first signs of public and social unraveling had appeared. Edward remained unaware of the full scope, still intoxicated by his own charm and Vanessa's attention, blind to the deliberate dismantling of his authority. Vanessa, sensing the vulnerability that had never existed before, realized that their indulgence had created exposure rather than dominance. The balance of power was shifting, quietly, decisively, and the stage was being set for the strategic consequences that James Whitman had already begun to orchestrate, ensuring that neither Edward nor Vanessa would escape accountability. James Whitman moved with the precision of a seasoned strategist, each action deliberate and meticulously timed to maximize impact. The gala had already exposed the audacity of Vanessa Blackwood and the moral weakness of Edward Harrington, but James knew that observation alone was insufficient. He needed to act publicly, decisively, and strategically, ensuring that both his daughter's dignity was preserved and that those who had humiliated her paid a consequence visible to the social and professional networks they had long relied upon. The first step came through discreet legal channels. James's team of elite attorneys reviewed every possible avenue of accountability, documenting Edward's neglect, Vanessa's aggressive interference, and any contractual or corporate oversights that could be leveraged. He ensured that the narrative was airtight, evidence of misconduct, harassment, and moral failure compiled and ready to act upon. Legal notices were strategically delivered, their timing coordinated to coincide with public appearances and media coverage, guaranteeing maximum exposure. Edward and Vanessa, unaware of the depth and precision of James's planning, remained blind to the storm quietly assembling around them. Simultaneously, James leveraged social networks to reinforce the consequences. Invitations to high-profile events were quietly rescinded, influential acquaintances received carefully worded updates about Edward and Vanessa's conduct, and subtle rumors, grounded in truth, began circulating within elite circles. Each whisper, each exclusion, chipped away at their perceived dominance, eroding the aura of invincibility that they had long depended upon. Vanessa, once untouchable in her social sphere, began to feel the precariousness of her position as admiration shifted into suspicion and judgment. The media was also subtly engaged. Social columns, paparazzi feeds, and high society blogs began to reflect Edward and Vanessa's missteps, framing them not as scandalous gossip but as documented consequence. Photos from the Gala, previously celebrated for glamour, were now repurposed to highlight the audacity of Vanessa's actions and Edward's inaction. Every public exposure was calculated to maximize reputational damage while maintaining Claire's privacy and dignity, reinforcing the contrast between the victims of humiliation and the orchestrator of justice. Throughout the process, Claire remained shielded, her name untarnished, her composure intact. The strategic intervention of her father allowed her to reclaim the moral high ground, her pregnancy and personal grace standing in stark contrast to Edward and Vanessa's unraveling. Edward's authority, carefully cultivated over years, collapsed under the weight of public, social, and legal scrutiny. Vanessa's confidence crumbled as the realization of her dependency on Edward's influence became painfully apparent. By the time the consequences fully unfolded, James Whitman had achieved what he intended, a precise, public dismantling of Edward and Vanessa's credibility and status. Claire emerged unscathed, dignified, and respected, her father's calculated strategy ensuring justice without emotional spectacle, proving that patience, intelligence, and authority could exact retribution far more effectively than impulsive anger or confrontation ever could. In the quiet days following the Gala and the public fallout, Claire Whitman felt the first stirrings of calm within the storm that had upended her life. The humiliation she had endured, once sharp and all-consuming, began to lose its power as she surrounded herself with those who genuinely cared for her well-being. Her father, James Whitman, remained a constant presence, calm, reassuring, and strategically protective. He offered guidance not through forceful instruction but through quiet counsel, reminding Claire of her strength, her dignity, and the calculated steps they had already set in motion to safeguard her and her child. Friends and confidants provided emotional support, offering comfort, laughter, and perspective. They reminded her of her own resilience, that the betrayal she had suffered was not a reflection of weakness but of circumstance and human failing. Conversations that once might have been filled with anger or despair were now opportunities for Claire to process her experiences and reframe them into lessons in patience and foresight. Each supportive interaction strengthened her confidence, reinforcing that she was capable of reclaiming her life without needing to stoop to vindictive tactics or impulsive confrontation. Claire began to focus on her own future, considering not only the immediate safety and well-being of her unborn child but also the long-term vision for her independence and personal growth. She reviewed her finances, relationships, and social connections, evaluating what served her purpose and what had been a source of unnecessary vulnerability. With each assessment, she felt more grounded and empowered, realizing that intelligence, careful planning, and emotional clarity could be more potent than anger or retaliation. Even simple routines took on new meaning. A morning walk became a meditative act of self-affirmation. Reading and journaling allowed her to articulate her goals and fears, turning emotional energy into strategic thought. Each day, she reclaimed pieces of herself that had been overshadowed by betrayal, humiliation, and uncertainty, replacing them with confidence, focus, and resilience. Claire's triumph was quiet but undeniable. She did not need to humiliate Edward or Vanessa in return, for her power lay in control over herself and her circumstances. The elegance with which she carried herself, her calm decisiveness, and her strategic patience highlighted a woman transformed, not by vengeance, but by intelligence, dignity, and foresight. In reclaiming her confidence, Claire proved that true empowerment emerges not from spectacle or retribution but from the unwavering commitment to preserve one's integrity, protect one's family, and navigate adversity with grace and insight. The months following the mansion gala unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony, each note resonating with consequences that Edward Harrington and Vanessa Blackwood could neither predict nor control. Their lavish facade of power and influence began to crumble as the ripple effects of James Whitman's strategic intervention took hold. Sponsors and business partners withdrew quietly but decisively, reluctant to associate with a man whose moral judgment had been publicly questioned. Social elites, once eager to flaunt connections to Edward, now maintained polite distance, exchanging subtle glances that carried unspoken judgment. Vanessa, whose confidence had always been tied to Edward's status, felt her own position waver with every passing day, the illusion of untouchable glamour replaced by vulnerability and uncertainty. The media, which had once chronicled their every indulgence with admiration, now shifted its focus. Headlines highlighted the audacity of Vanessa's public attack and Edward's failure to protect his pregnant wife, framing the event as a cautionary tale of hubris and moral decay. Social commentary and high society blogs dissected the gala in meticulous detail, ensuring that both Edward and Vanessa were held accountable not only in private circles but in the court of public opinion. Their social capital, painstakingly built over years, dissolved almost imperceptibly but irrevocably, leaving them exposed and isolated. Claire, in contrast, emerged with her dignity intact, her reputation untarnished, and her sense of empowerment strengthened. The protective measures orchestrated by her father had shielded her from both humiliation and financial exploitation. Surrounded by family, close friends, and a network of loyal allies, she embraced the new chapter of her life with clarity and purpose. Every step she took, from preparing for the arrival of her child to reclaiming control over her finances, was guided by the lessons of patience, strategic foresight, and resilience she had cultivated during the months of adversity. Her life was no longer defined by betrayal or dependency, it was shaped by autonomy, intelligence, and the unwavering commitment to protect those she loved. James Whitman's role in the resolution was decisive yet understated. He had acted not out of reckless anger, but with the precision of a master strategist, ensuring that justice was delivered publicly and effectively. Edward and Vanessa faced the consequences of their actions in a manner that was visible, undeniable, and proportionate, their social and financial standing irreparably diminished. At the same time, Claire's triumph was neither vengeful nor ostentatious, it was the result of deliberate planning, measured action, and the quiet strength of a family united by loyalty and integrity. In the end, the narrative closed on a note of poetic justice. Edward and Vanessa, once symbols of indulgence and arrogance, were reduced to a cautionary tale of recklessness and betrayal, while Claire stood empowered, resilient, and dignified. Her child, a living testament to endurance and hope, became the center of a life redefined by love, autonomy, and purpose. The story emphasized accountability, the protective power of family, and the profound strength of a woman who had endured public humiliation yet emerged victorious, proving that patience, intelligence, and integrity are the ultimate instruments of justice and empowerment.